Welcome to today's Deep Dive. It is wonderful to have you with us today. I actually want to start by asking you to use your imagination for a second.
Oh, setting the scene right away.
Yeah, exactly. So picture Jane Eyre. You know her, the classic 19th century heroine from the Charlotte Bronte novel.
Right, of course.
Picture her sitting up in her bed at Lowood School on this chilly, damp English night. She pulls a woolen shawl over her shoulders, stares into the dark, and decides purely through her own rational deduction, by the way, that she needs to completely change her life.
A very modern, independent moment.
Exactly. She decides to place an advertisement in a provincial newspaper, use a postal service to receive replies, and eventually travel by a wheeled stagecoach as an unmarried independent woman to take a new job in a new town.
Right.
Now, I want you to take that exact character with all her fierce independence, her reliance on public infrastructure, her modern sensibilities, and pack her bags. But we aren't moving her across the Yorkshire moors. We are picking Jane Eyre up and dropping her directly across the Mediterranean into the Middle East in the early 1800s.
Wow.
Specifically, let's drop her into the bustling streets of Cairo, the sprawling hills of Istanbul, or the walled city of Tehran. What happens to her? Would she survive? Would anyone in that society even understand a single thing she was trying to do?
It is a brilliant, just a completely disorienting thought experiment, and the short answer is no. They wouldn't understand her at all.
Not at all.
No, she would be an absolute alien. I mean, she would be operating on a societal operating system that simply did not exist in those cities at that time.
Right.
But diving into exactly why she would be an alien, what specific mechanisms of society were missing, that's the key to unlocking this entire discussion.
And answering that bizarre question unlocks what is arguably one of the most misunderstood, complex, and fascinating chapters of global history.
Yeah.
And that is our mission today. We are pulling our insights from an incredibly comprehensive and eye-opening book called The Islamic Enlightenment, The Struggle Between Faith and Reason, 1798 to Modern Times by Christopher de Balague.
A fantastic source.
Our goal for this deep dive is to shatter a very pervasive, very stubborn myth. It's the myth that the Islamic world somehow just skipped modernization, that it entirely missed out on the Enlightenment, and that it has just been frozen in time while the West relentlessly moved forward.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
We are going to explore the brilliant, deeply conflicted, and often completely forgotten pioneers who dragged their societies, sometimes kicking and screaming, into the modern age.
Before we go any further, though, it is crucial to set the stage for you, the listener, regarding the nature of this material.
Good point.
Because the history we are covering today deals with deeply complex, politically charged, and religiously sensitive topics. We are going to be talking about everything from the emergence of secular liberalism in the Middle East to the roots of radical Islamism and the violent clashes between differing worldviews.
That is an important point, and we really need to make it crystal clear right up front. We are not taking any sides here.
Exactly.
We are not endorsing any of the religious ideologies, political movements, or historical viewpoints that we are about to discuss. Whether it's the actions of European colonial empires, the decrees of religious clerics, or the rise of political Islam.
Right.
Our sole job today is to impartially report on the author's historical analysis. We are here to help you understand the historical ideas contained in the original text, nothing more, nothing less.
Because for you, understanding this history is essentially a cheat code for understanding modern geopolitics. We are going to look at a civilization that was forced to compress a Reformation, an Enlightenment, and an Industrial Revolution processes that took Europe 4 or 5 centuries to slowly digest and figure out into just a few frantic, terrifying decades.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's go back to our Jane Eyre thought experiment, because the author uses this to perfectly illustrate the staggering gap between the West and the Middle East around the year 1800.
Yeah, the gap is massive.
Right. Jane Eyre, as a character, relies on this massive, invisible infrastructure of modernity. She needs a printing press for that provincial newspaper where she places her ad. She needs an organized postal service to receive letters from potential employers.
She needs paved, safe roads for that wheeled transport.
Exactly. And most importantly, on a psychological level, she needs a society that accepts the concept of an unmarried woman acting as a sovereign individual, traveling alone without ruining her reputation or inviting violence.
Right, which is huge.
But beyond all the physical infrastructure and the social norms, she needs one fundamental thing to make it all work: a literate public.
This is where the statistics from the source text just stop you in your tracks. At the turn of the 19th century, the literacy rate in Turkey, Egypt, and Iran, which were the 3 most important intellectual, cultural, and political hubs of the region, was roughly 3%.
3%? That's just wild.
Just 3% of the population could read and write. Now, contrast that with England at the exact same time, where the literacy rate was more than 68% for men and 43% for women.
Night and day.
And if you looked at Amsterdam, which was the world's capital of literacy and publishing back then, it was 85% for men and 64% for women.
It's hard to even wrap your head around a 3% literacy rate.
Yeah.
In a room of 100 people, only 3 can read a public notice, a newspaper, or a book. How does a society even function on a national scale with those numbers?
Barely.
And I'm assuming this wasn't just some accident of history or a lack of schools. There had to be systemic reasons for it.
There were deeply systemic reasons. The author explains why Jane Eyre would be an impossibility in 1800s Istanbul or Cairo, and it fundamentally comes down to the control of information.
Okay.
The movable type printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany in the 15th century, and it completely revolutionized Europe. It democratized information, fueled the Protestant Reformation, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution.
Right, we all learned about Gutenberg.
But when the printing press appeared on Ottoman shores in the 1490s, the religious and political authorities banned it. They eventually went so far as to make printing a capital crime.
A capital crime. So you could be executed for printing a book. What was the underlying fear driving a policy that extreme?
The official reasoning was deeply theological. The authorities feared that mass-producing the Quran, making it cheap and universally accessible, would lead ignorant people to misinterpret the Word of God.
Interesting.
They believed that only trained, certified clerics should handle the sacred text. But there were also massive socioeconomic ripple effects. The Ottoman Empire had an enormous guild of calligraphers and scribes.
Oh, of course, the people writing it all out by hand.
Right, tens of thousands of men whose entire livelihood depended on hand-copying manuscripts. Introducing a printing press would have decimated their industry overnight. So to protect religious orthodoxy and economic stability, they banned the technology.
The cascading effect of a decision like that over 3 centuries is almost unimaginable. Without mass printing, you have no newspapers, no pamphlets, no affordable books.
None.
Without those, you have no reading public. And without a reading public, you cannot have public opinion. You cannot have the rapid spread of new scientific discoveries, medical advancements, or philosophical debates. You are essentially freezing your society's intellectual capacity in amber while the rest of the world builds universities and laboratories.
Precisely. You drop Jane Eyre into that environment, and she literally has no voice, no medium to express it, and no audience to hear it. The infrastructure of her independence simply does not exist.
But the author doesn't just leave us in that bleak, stagnant picture of 1800. He fast-forwards just a bit to show us the incredible whiplash of change that was about to hit the region.
Yeah, things speed up dramatically.
To contrast with Jane Eyre, he introduces us to a real historical woman who is essentially the Ottoman equivalent of a Bronte sister, but living a few decades later. Her name is Fatma Alay.
Her story is truly incredible and serves as a perfect microcosm of this hyper-compressed modernization. Fatma Alay grew up in the 1860s in the Ottoman Empire, in a very rigid, compartmentalized society.
Very traditional.
Yes, she went into purdah, the traditional seclusion of women in the domestic sphere, at age 15. She was married off at 19 to a man she barely knew. Her mother was deeply traditional and firmly believed that learning French, which was the language of the infidels and the language of European diplomacy, was practically a flag of apostasy.
I find it so compelling that Fatma Alay secretly learned French anyway. She had this relentless internal drive. She essentially taught herself the language of the Enlightenment in the shadows of a deeply traditional household.
She was brilliant.
And then she started writing novels, just like the Bronte sisters, who famously used male-sounding pseudonyms like Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell because they doubted a Victorian public would read books by unknown women. Fatma initially published her work under pseudonyms like a woman.
It's the exact same parallel.
She was navigating the exact same patriarchal barriers, just in a different cultural context. But what really stands out is the sheer volume of technological and social change she witnessed in a single lifetime.
It is staggering when you map it out. She was born into a world that, technologically speaking, closely resembled the Middle Ages. But within her lifetime, she lived to see steamships plowing the waters of the Bosporus.
Wow.
She saw the telegraph arrive, instantaneously connecting Istanbul to Paris and London. She saw the establishment of an Ottoman postal service in 1840, finally creating the infrastructure that Jane Eyre took for granted.
Imagine the psychological toll of that. You go from a society where news travels at the speed of a horse to reading a telegram from across the world in an afternoon.
I want you to imagine the sheer, dizzying whiplash of experiencing the invention of the printing press, the telegraph, the steamship, and the railway all at almost exactly the same time.
It's almost too much for one generation to process.
The West had centuries to slowly digest the implications of mass communication with the printing press before they ever had to deal with the speed of the telegraph. Fatma Ali's society had to swallow the entirety of the industrial and information revolutions in one giant gulp.
Right.
And what is so remarkable about Fatma is that she didn't retreat from it. She utilized it brilliantly. She used that newly embraced institution of the press to write newspaper columns advocating for girls' education. She publicly fought against the stock male denigration of women in Ottoman society.
Her personal life also reflects this massive tectonic shift. Later in her life, her younger daughter, Zubaydah, did something that would have been unthinkable a generation prior. She converted to Catholicism and became a nun in Paris.
A huge scandal.
To track her down and try to understand what happened, Fatma Ali traveled around Europe. A Muslim woman, traveling alone or with another daughter, navigating an infidel land, holding deep philosophical conversations with the locals in French.
Unprecedented.
The author points out that in her youth, such a journey would have been considered utterly defiling to her morals. She would have been shunned by her community upon return. But by the end of the century, society had shifted so dramatically that she is actually honored with inclusion in the Women's Library of the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893.
It perfectly illustrates the author's core thesis. When Westerners casually say Islam needs an enlightenment, they are entirely ignoring the fact that women like Fatma Ali were actively living through one.
Exactly.
They were fighting the exact same battles for equality. They were utilizing the exact same tools of modernity, the printing press, the novel, the newspaper column, but they were doing it organically within a uniquely Islamic context.
But exploring Fatma Ali's triumphs naturally brings up a massive question. How did the Islamic world get so far behind in the first place? Why was their literacy at 3% in 1800?
It's a fair question.
Because anyone who has taken a basic world history class knows that Islam wasn't always technologically or philosophically lagging behind Europe. In fact, for centuries, it was the exact opposite. Europe was in the Dark Ages, and the Middle East was the center of global knowledge.
To understand the stagnation that the 19th century reformers had to fight against, the source material takes us further back to the Islamic Golden Age. This period runs roughly from the 8th to the 13th centuries.
Okay.
During this time, particularly under the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad, the Islamic world was the undisputed heavyweight champion of science, reason, medicine, and philosophy.
They were light years ahead.
They built an incredibly sophisticated administration that united trade and knowledge from India to Spain. They were systematically translating classical Greek texts, Aristotle, Plato, Galen, preserving them while Europe had largely forgotten them.
Right.
They were discovering the clinical difference between measles and smallpox, popularizing Arabic numerals and the concept of zero, developing algebra, and even experimenting with optics and early camera obscuras.
The contrast with Europe at that time is almost comical. I love the historical anecdote the author includes about an Englishman named Adelard of Bath from the 12th century.
Wow, that's a great story.
He was this curious scholar who traveled around the Mediterranean, absorbing Arab knowledge in places like Sicily and Antioch. He basically wrote letters home to mock his fellow Europeans.
He was not holding back.
Not at all. He said he learned to use reason as his guide from his Arab masters, whereas he felt Europeans were enthralled by a picture of authority. He literally asked, what else can authority be called but a halter, like a halter on a horse, blinding you and leading you around? The Islamic world at that time was the global beacon of free thought and empirical inquiry.
And that intellectual freedom wasn't secular in the modern sense. It was deeply rooted in their theology. In the 8th century, a highly influential philosophical movement called the Mutazilites gained prominence.
The Mutazilites, right.
They argued fiercely for human free will over divine fatalism. They pointed to specific Quranic verses suggesting that God despised an inactive mind, arguing that reason was a God-given tool meant to be used.
That's fascinating.
They even argued against anthropomorphism, the idea that God has human-like traits, and maintained a highly abstract philosophical view of the divine. Crucially, they argued that the Quran was not co-eternal with God, but was a created thing.
Why is that distinction, whether the Quran is eternal or created, so important for science and philosophy?
Because if a text is co-eternal with God, it exists outside of time and space, and every single word must be taken literally and applied rigidly forever, regardless of changing circumstances.
No room for interpretation.
Exactly. But if it is a created thing, created at a specific moment in human history to address specific people, then it is open to context, interpretation, and rational analysis. That theological breathing room allowed philosophy and science to flourish.
That makes total sense. And it produced some incredibly vibrant historical figures.
I was particularly struck by the description of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. He was this brilliant 11th century polymath. What was his actual day-to-day life like? I always pictured these historical scholars as very austere monk-like figures.
Far from it. Avicenna was a man of the world, serving as a vizier and a physician to various rulers. He wrote the medical canon, an encyclopedia of medicine that was so advanced it was used as a standard textbook in European universities for centuries.
Incredible.
He wrote a famous, highly complex philosophical proof for the existence of God that influenced Thomas Aquinas. But he was also fiercely independent and pragmatic in his personal life. The text notes that he drank a cup of wine every day because he claimed it helped him study and maintain his energy.
So much for the austere monk.
Right, and he observed the daily prayers not merely out of dogmatic fear that God demanded it, but because he found the ritual improved his mental concentration. He was the ultimate rationalist, synthesizing his faith with the deeply empirical approach to the world. So if they had this incredible intellectual momentum, this thriving culture of inquiry and scientific discovery, what stopped it? Did the society just slowly lose interest in science over centuries, or did something actively break the system?
It was broken by civilization-level trauma. The source traces a tragic decline from this peak of rationalism, driven by a series of devastating existential shocks.
It wasn't gradual.
Not at all. First, the European Crusades began at the end of the 11th century, bringing violent, religiously motivated armies into the heart of the Levant. Then, even more destructively, the Mongol invasions swept through from the east in the 13th century.
Right, the Mongols.
The Mongols utterly devastated Baghdad in 1258, destroying the Grand Library, the House of Wisdom. Legend says the Tigris River ran black with the ink of scholars' books and red with the blood of the slaughtered. At the same time, the Christian Reconquista was slowly but surely pushing Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula in the west.
It sounds like an apocalyptic scenario. Your borders are collapsing from every direction, your greatest cities are being burned to the ground, and your libraries are being thrown into rivers.
It was a profound psychological shock. And history shows us that in times of acute trauma, terror, and societal collapse, populations rarely turn to open-minded philosophical speculation or scientific experimentation.
No, they go into survival mode.
They turn defensive, they want absolute certainty, they want to know why God is punishing them, and they seek to win back divine favor through strict, uncompromising piety. This is where the theological tide violently turned against the rationalist Mutazilites and the philosophers.
To replace them.
Conservative thinkers like Ibn Taymiyyah emerged and argued that Greek rationalism and philosophical arrogance were exactly why God had unleashed the Mongols upon them. He asserted that the goal of the believer wasn't to understand the mechanics of the universe or to know God through complex philosophy, but simply and strictly to obey him.
I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this decline, because the author defines two massive, fundamental conceptual shifts that lock this defensiveness into place for centuries. The first is the move from a concept called ijtihad to a concept called taqlid. How did that affect the everyday intellectual life of the society?
It changed everything. Ijtihad is the exercise of independent reasoning to interpret Islamic law and discover God's will for new, unprecedented situations. It requires a dynamic, questioning, highly educated mind.
Right.
Think of Etihad like being a master chef. You understand the underlying chemistry of the ingredients, the flour, the yeast, the heat, so you can invent entirely new dishes that still respect the core rules of cooking.
I love that analogy.
But as the religious establishment grew more conservative and traumatized, they declared that the great scholars of the past had already figured everything out perfectly. They officially closed the doors of Ijtihad and enforced taqlid.
And what does taqlid mean?
Taqlid means the blind emulation of past authorities. To continue the analogy, taqlid is like following a baking recipe exactly as your great-grandmother wrote it hundreds of years ago, terrified that changing a single measurement, even if you have a better oven now, will ruin the cake and anger God. You don't question, you just copy.
That is a brilliant way to explain it. You go from a society of master chefs innovating new ideas to a society rigidly copying old recipes. And that leads directly to the second major conceptual shift. The author discusses the rise of Bila Kayfa.
Yes, Bila Kayfa translates literally to without asking how. It was popularized by a theologian named al-Ash'ari. The doctrine argues that the human mind is simply too frail, too limited, and too corrupted to understand the infinite mind of God.
So just don't even try.
Exactly. Therefore, when you encounter a theological mystery, a contradiction, or a strict religious dictate, you do not try to parse it with Greek logic. You just accept it bila kayf without asking how or why. It is fundamentally a doctrine of absolute abnegation of the intellect.
And the real-world consequences of replacing independent reasoning with taqlid and bila kayf were absolutely disastrous for scientific progress. The author gives a heartbreaking example of this in practice from the year 1580 in Istanbul.
The observatory.
Yes. At that time, the Ottoman Empire had the only remaining, fully functioning astronomical observatory in the Islamic world, located at Galata. The astronomers there were doing complex mathematical work charting the heavens, but a terrible plague broke out in the city.
And people panicked.
They panicked, and the conservative clerics, steeped in the mindset of Bila Kayf, declared that prying into the secrets of the heavens with telescopes and math was arrogant. They claimed the astronomers had angered God, and the plague was his punishment.
And the political authorities, bowing to the pressure of the clerics and a terrified populace, ordered a naval squad to go ashore and completely destroy the observatory. They smashed the instruments. They essentially outlawed astronomy. By the 18th century, the vibrant, inquisitive culture that had produced Avicenna was largely dead, replaced entirely by scholasticism, literalism, and a deep suspicion of anything new.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the violently abrupt wake-up call that shatters this stagnation. The year is 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh from the radical secularism of the French Revolution, invades Egypt.
The spark.
And he doesn't just bring an army of soldiers. He brings an army of scientists, engineers, and printing presses. He brings the full, aggressive, ideological weight of the European Enlightenment directly to the shores of Alexandria.
This is the spark. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the moment one of the world's most modern, technologically advanced, and expansionist societies slams headfirst into one of the most intellectually defensive and stagnant.
It's a massive collision.
Huge. The author meticulously traces the Egyptian reaction to this collision through 3 generations of local thinkers, and it serves as a masterclass in how a culture processes overwhelming shock.
It begins with a man named Sheikh al-Jabarti. He was a conservative, orthodox, religious scholar and chronicler who witnessed the French invasion firsthand. Jabarti represents the initial shades of contact, pure, visceral horror, mixed with undeniable, agonizing awe.
He was deeply conflicted.
He looked at the French and was utterly repulsed by their secularism, their lack of traditional modesty, their drinking, and their total disregard for the Islamic religious hierarchy. He genuinely believed that God was punishing Muslims for their sins by sending these filthy, immoral invaders.
But the genius of Jabarti's chronicles is his honesty. He hated the French, but he couldn't look away from their science. The French set up an Institut d'Egypte in Cairo, a scientific academy, and Jabarti actually goes to visit it.
Which is wild for someone so conservative.
Exactly. He writes in his diaries about watching the French engineers launch a hot air balloon over the city. He is totally bewildered by the sight of a massive object floating in the sky without magic. He watches French chemists perform experiments that instantly change the color of liquids or create small explosions.
It must have looked like witchcraft.
He admits in his writings that his mind couldn't even conceive of the principles behind what they were doing. He prayed for God to strike the French dumb, but he was painfully forced to concede that these people, whom he viewed as spiritually bankrupt infidels, possessed an intellectual and material power that the Islamic world had entirely lost.
Yet, despite seeing the hot air balloons and the chemistry, Ghiberti couldn't make the intellectual leap. Because of his deep, lifelong roots in Taclit and Bilakate, he just couldn't accept that human reason and empirical science could ever substitute for divine revelation. He recorded the shock, but he couldn't process the cure.
Which is exactly why the baton of progress passes to his pupil, the second generation in this narrative, Hassan el-Attar. Attar was younger, more flexible, and far more curious. He engaged with them.
He didn't just hide in his home writing despairing diaries like his teacher. He actively engaged with the French scientists. He went back to their institute. He looked at their modern astronomical texts. He examined their maps. And he realized a very painful, undeniable truth. The West had acquired a massive, insurmountable intellectual edge.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
But Attar's reaction is crucial. He didn't abandon his Islamic faith and declare the West superior in all things. Instead, the shock of the French invasion forced him to look backward in order to move forward.
He went digging in the archives, right?
Exactly. He scoured old, forgotten Islamic manuscripts in the dusty libraries of Cairo, and he rediscovered the Golden Age. He read the works of the Mutazilites, he read Avicenna, he read the ancient mathematicians.
He realized they used to have this power. Yes, he realized that medieval Muslims used to be scientists too. He realized that the intellectual tools the French were using, reason, empiricism, inquiry, were not inherently Christian or secular European inventions. They were tools that the Islamic world had once wielded masterfully and then foolishly discarded.
He basically found the blueprints of their own forgotten greatness. He realized that Islam, in its pure original intellectual form, wasn't opposed to science at all. It was only the recent centuries of defensive Taclit that made it seem that way.
Exactly right.
But Attar was living in a very dangerous time. He had to teach these radical reformist ideas behind closed doors to very small groups of trusted students because the Orthodox religious establishment was still incredibly hostile to change.
He needed cover.
He needed a powerful protector, which he eventually found in Egypt's new, ruthless, modernizing autocrat, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali wanted a modern army to rival the Europeans, and he knew he needed modern science to get it.
But the real world-changing breakthrough comes with Attar's own pupil. He represents the third generation of this intellectual awakening, Rifa al-Tahtawi.
Tahtawi is fascinating.
Tahtawi is a monumental figure in this history. In 1826, Muhammad Ali decides to send a delegation of Egyptian students to Paris. The goal is simple: learn Western sciences, engineering, and military tactics, then come back and modernize the Egyptian state.
And Tahtawi goes with them.
Tahtawi is sent along as their religious chaplain, essentially to make sure the young men don't lose their morals in the central streets of Paris.
But Tahtawi ends up being the most profoundly changed of them all. He learns French fluently. He starts reading the great Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu.
He absorbs everything.
He observes French society with his incredibly sharp analytical mind. He watches their parliament, he reads their constitution, he studies how their civil society functions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the typical historical assumption is that a man like Tahtawi has two choices. Either he comes back to Egypt and says, we need to abandon our backward Islamic traditions and become culturally French, which would get him killed as an apostate.
Right.
Or he comes back and says, the French are evil, their ideas are poison, we must reject everything, which leaves Egypt weak and vulnerable to further colonization.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Tahtawi rejects both of those dead ends.
Yeah.
He does something of absolute psychological genius. He maps the abstract concepts of the French Enlightenment directly onto traditional, deeply respected Islamic concepts.
Yes. He looks at the French ideals that sparked their revolution and translates them culturally, not just linguistically. When he writes about the French political concept of liberty, the freedom of the individual from tyranny, he tells his readers in Egypt that this is essentially the exact same thing as the ancient Islamic concept of justice, or adl.
So smart.
When he reads about the French ideal of equality, he equates it with the Islamic imperative of charity and brotherhood. He argues, using Islamic texts and the history his teacher Attar uncovered, that the things that make Europe strong, wealthy, and modern actually existed in embryonic form within early Islam.
That is incredibly smart. It's like societal cognitive behavioral therapy.
Hmm.
He realized that if you tell people their culture is fundamentally broken and they need to copy their enemies, they will put up their defensive shields and fight you to the death.
Human nature.
But if you tell them that modernizing, adopting constitutions, and embracing science is actually just returning to their true, original Islamic roots, you completely disarm their defenses. You provide the theological and intellectual permission structure for a devout traditional society to embrace modern science, representative government, and rational thought without feeling like they are committing cultural suicide.
That is the exact heavy lifting of a cultural enlightenment. He provided a bridge between faith and reason that allowed an entire generation of Egyptians to move forward.
And this awakening, this desperate search for a way to modernize without losing their soul, wasn't just isolated to Cairo. The deep dive shifts focus to show how this vortex of change started ripping through Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and Tehran, the capital of Qajar Iran.
The change was regional.
But if you look at how the West viewed this region at the time, there is a massive, almost comical blind spot. The author has a real bone to pick with 19th century Western travel writers.
Oh, he heavily critiques famous European writers like the French novelist Gustave Flaubert, the Italian journalist Edmondo de Amicis, and the British Orientalist and political officer Gertrude Bell.
They got it so wrong.
Throughout the 19th century, they traveled to the Middle East and wrote these immensely popular, beautifully written, but incredibly condescending accounts for audiences back in Paris and London. Flaubert wrote from Cairo that nothing changes in the Orient, describing it as a static, picturesque diorama of the ancient Bible.
It's such a caricature.
Gertrude Bell looked at the vast landscapes of Persia and called it a place with the fine simplicity of death, claiming the East knew absolutely nothing of the greater modernizing world.
They were completely blind. They came looking for a romanticized Orientalist fantasy, a sleeping, timeless, exotic East filled with bazaars, veiled women, and ancient ruins, and so that is exactly what they saw. They entirely missed the fact that these societies were undergoing seismic, agonizing revolutionary shifts right under their noses.
To debunk these arrogant Western accounts, the author points to the actual historical actors in Istanbul and Tehran who were driving modernization, often at great personal risk.
Like Sanizada Atollah.
Yes, in Istanbul, you have a polymath named Sanizada Atollah. He was a deeply religious cleric, trained in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, but he was also ferociously curious. He taught himself Latin, French, and Italian so he could read European medical texts, and he became a tireless champion of modern anatomy and medicine.
He was fighting the clerics from the inside.
He was fighting a daily battle to convince his conservative peers that embracing empirical medical science and understanding how the human body actually works wasn't an offense against God's mysteries.
There's a startling visual mentioned in the text that perfectly captures this battle. There's a historical photograph from later in the century of Ottoman medical students in Istanbul. They are posing alongside a dissected human corpse and several human skeletons.
Such a powerful image.
For centuries, dissecting a human body was a massive, unbreakable religious taboo in the Islamic world. It was considered a desecration of the dead. But here are these young men wearing traditional fezzes, but also modern military-style uniforms, proudly breaking that ancient taboo in the name of empirical science and public health. That photograph alone shatters the idea of a static, unchanging East.
And in Iran, you see the exact same struggles. The author introduces a man named Mirza Saleh, who was sent by the Iranian crown prince to travel to London in 1815 to learn languages and printing.
Mirza Saleh is a great example.
Mirza Saleh's journey is a perfect microcosm of the internal cultural struggle. Before he left Tehran, a conservative friend of his named Ismail begged him not to go. Ismail asked what possible benefit there could be in traveling to a land of ignorant Christians, reflecting that deep-seated fear of cultural contamination and the old, outdated assumption of innate Muslim superiority.
But Mirza Saleh fires back with this beautiful, poetic defense of the unprejudiced acquisition of knowledge. He doesn't get defensive. He essentially says to his friend, "Why shouldn't I learn something new every day to shine a light into the eye of my heart?"
It's a great quote.
He goes to London. He immerses himself in a completely alien culture. He studies British history, parliamentary politics, and industrial technology. And he ends up buying a printing press, shipping it back to Iran, and establishing the country's first newspaper. He literally forces his society to engage with the modern world by providing them the mechanism of mass communication.
What's truly fascinating is how these new, organic Enlightenment perspectives arising within the Middle East directly clashed with the romanticized views of the Western tourists. The author uses the feral dogs of Istanbul as a brilliant, unexpected case study of this clash.
Oh, this is such a great anecdote. It perfectly illustrates the divide. So you have Edmondo de Amicis, the Italian travel writer who comes to Istanbul for a brief vacation. He writes this highly dramatic, gothic, romanticized description of the massive packs of feral dogs that roamed the city streets.
He loved them.
He treats them as this picturesque, timeless element of the exotic, untamed East. He loves them because they fit his aesthetic fantasy of a pre-modern city.
But then you have Ibrahim Sanasi, a Turkish intellectual playwright and one of the founding fathers of modern Ottoman journalism. He lives in Istanbul. He looks at those exact same packs of dogs, but he looks at them through the lens of a modernizing, practical local.
He sees reality.
He writes a scathing newspaper column arguing that the dogs are a public nuisance. He points out that they are flea-ridden, they cause violent turf wars at night that keep citizens awake, and they are a massive vector for disease and a threat to public health. He argues they should be rounded up and removed to rural areas, and he declares in print that cleanliness is next to godliness.
It's a purely utilitarian Enlightenment perspective. Sanasi isn't looking for a romantic postcard to send back to Paris. He wants a clean, functional, sanitary, modern city for his own people.
Exactly.
The European tourist wants to preserve the decay because it looks artistic. The local intellectual wants to clean it up using reason and civic planning. It proves definitively that the desire for progress was bubbling up from within the culture, not just being forced on them by outside missionaries.
However, as the 19th century progressed, the stakes of this modernization process got incredibly high. The Islamic world wasn't just dealing with abstract philosophical debates about reason or civic debates about stray dogs. They were facing a terrifying, immediate, existential threat, aggressive European imperialism.
The walls were closing in.
The industrialization that the Middle East was trying to catch up to had given Europe terrifying military power. The British militarily occupied Egypt in 1882 to secure the Suez Canal. The Russian Empire and the British Empire were actively carving up Iran into spheres of influence in what was called the Great Game. The once mighty Ottoman Empire was mockingly called the sick man of Europe, slowly being dismembered piece by piece.
So the reformers, the intellectual heirs of Tatawi and Mirza Saleh, are faced with this impossible, agonizing paradox. How do you adopt the technology, the military organization, and the scientific methods of the West in order to fight off the West without completely losing your own Islamic soul and effectively becoming the West?
That's the ultimate dilemma.
How do you modernize without Westernizing?
And this intense pressure cooker brings us to one of the most complex, ambiguous, and fascinating characters in the entire deep dive, Jamal al-Din Afghani. Afghani looked at the piecemeal reforms, the translations, the new schools, the newspapers, and realized it wasn't enough. It was too slow.
Time was running out.
It wasn't going to stop the relentless march of European imperialism. He realized he needed an ideology powerful enough to mobilize millions of illiterate or semi-literate people across entirely different national borders and sectarian divides.
Afghani himself is just a wild, almost cinematic, historical figure. He was an elitist intellectual. He became a Freemason. He spent significant time living in London and Paris, and he used to sit in the bustling cafes of Cairo, smoking cigars and holding court with students and politicians.
He knew how to work a room.
He was deeply, almost ruthlessly pragmatic. The source notes that he deliberately hid his true origins. He was actually born in a Shia-majority area of Iran, but he adopted the name Afghani to pass as a Sunni Muslim from Afghanistan. He knew that if he wanted to appeal to the vast majority of the Muslim world, he couldn't be pigeonholed as a minority Shia. He was a master of political theater.
What's fascinating here is the tension between his public persona and his underlying private philosophy. Deep down, based on his writings and private conversations, Afghani believed that philosophers were inherently superior to religious prophets.
Which is a very dangerous thing to say out loud.
Very. He believed that prophets were necessary only because they could communicate basic moral truths to the uneducated, irrational masses through vivid symbols, miracles, and rigid laws. Philosophers, on the other hand, could grasp universal truths directly through pure reason.
But he kept that quiet.
Yes, despite his unorthodox, highly elitist private views, he was a political realist. He realized that secular philosophy or dry political theory would never, ever unite the masses of the Middle East. Religion was the only tool potent enough, the only language universally understood, to rally the people against the encroaching British and Russian empires.
So he takes the anti-imperialist political struggle and tightly wraps it in the sacred banner of faith. He becomes the great pioneer of pan-Islamism. This is the revolutionary idea that Muslims across the world, regardless of whether they were Egyptian or Indian, Ottoman or Iranian, Sunni or Shia, needed to unite under their shared religious identity to throw off the yoke of the Christian West.
It was a rallying cry.
He wasn't preaching religion for the sake of piety. He was utilizing religion as a modern political weapon of mass mobilization.
But Afghani was ultimately a provocateur, a shadow figure who agitated behind the scenes and got deported from almost every country he visited. The man who actually institutionalized the intellectual side of this reform, who built the lasting framework for the Islamic Enlightenment, was his most famous and devoted student, Muhammad Abduh.
Abduh changed everything.
Abduh is a completely different personality. He isn't a shadowy cafe agitator. He is an esteemed scholar who eventually becomes the Grand Mufti of Egypt, the highest, most respected religious authority in the entire country. He decides to work within the establishment to change the establishment.
And Abduh's intellectual contribution is absolutely monumental. Remember those two paralyzing concepts we talked about earlier that caused the centuries of stagnation? Taqlid, the blind emulation of past scholars, and Bil Kayf, accepting religious dictates without asking how or why.
He goes right after them.
Abduh took a theological sledgehammer to both of them. Using his supreme authority as the Grand Mufti, he officially smashed the concept of Taqlid, and he forcefully flung the gates of Ijtihad wide open again for the first time in centuries.
A massive moment.
He told Muslims across the world that they didn't need to blindly follow the rulings of medieval scholars who lived in a completely different era. He argued that anyone with a Quran, a sound moral compass, and an educated rational mind could use independent reasoning to discover God's will for the complex modern age.
He was incredibly radical for a man in his position. Because he opened the gates of Ijtihad, he was able to legally and theologically embrace Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, incorporating it into his understanding of God's natural law, arguing that science was simply the study of God's mechanisms.
The Grand Mufti embracing Darwin, that's huge.
He argued forcefully against the traditional practice of polygamy, stating that while it was permitted in early Islam for specific historical reasons, it was fundamentally incompatible with modern domestic harmony and the true spirit of justice. He even went so far as to revive the ancient, controversial Mu'tazilite idea that the Quran was a created entity.
Bringing back the Golden Age ideas.
By declaring it created, he meant its legal rulings could be interpreted rationally and adapted based on the changing circumstances of the time, rather than being treated as a rigid, static document that applied literally to every new political or technological situation.
Abduh is basically the absolute peak of the Islamic Enlightenment. He is successfully synthesizing deep, genuine religious faith with modern empirical scientific rationalism. He is actively corresponding with Western literary giants like Leo Tolstoy about philosophy and nonviolence.
They wrote letters back and forth.
He is pushing for massive structural educational reforms at Al-Azhar, the ancient 1,000-year-old university in Cairo, trying to force them to teach modern sciences alongside theology. And his influence spreads.
It really did.
Under the intellectual umbrella created by thinkers like Abduh, the Islamic world started seeing real political progress. Constitutions were drafted and fought for in Iran during the Constitutional Revolution of 1906 and in the Ottoman Empire. Parliaments were formed. There was a very real, tangible trajectory toward liberal, secular modernization and representative government.
Which brings us to a painful pivot point. This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question for you, the listener, trying to understand the world today.
Yes, the big question.
If things were progressing so well, if the Islamic Enlightenment was taking root, if reformers were successfully blending faith and reason, and parliaments were being established, what went wrong? Why is the narrative today, in the 21st century, so overwhelmingly focused on radicalism, religious fundamentalism, and sectarian violence?
Right. How on earth do we get from the Grand Mufti of Egypt happily corresponding with Leo Tolstoy about shared humanistic values to the modern headlines of extremism, terrorism, and theocracy? It feels like a total derailment.
It was a total derailment. The author identifies the massive, devastating pivot point that shattered this trajectory World War I. The Great War and its cynical aftermath completely derailed the organic, internal progress of the Islamic Enlightenment.
It's hard to overstate the trauma of the First World War in the Middle East. It wasn't just a war, it was the collapse of their entire political universe. The Ottoman Empire, which had been the seat of the Islamic Caliphate for centuries, was completely destroyed.
It was wiped off the map.
But the aftermath was even worse. The victorious European powers, primarily Britain and France, didn't liberate the region. They secretly carved up the Middle East through agreements like Sykes-Picot and formalized it at the Treaty of Versailles. They drew arbitrary lines on maps, created entirely artificial borders that ignored ethnic and religious realities, installed pliant puppet monarchs to serve their interests, and imposed brutal, extractive colonial rule.
This mass subjugation created a profound, searing sense of humiliation, impotence, and betrayal across the region. Think about the psychological impact. The liberal reformers, the students of Tatawi and Abdu, had spent decades telling their people, we need to emulate the Western political models. We need their constitutions, their parliaments, their liberal values.
And then those very same Westerners show up with guns.
Exactly. The Western liberal democracies arrived with armies, revealed themselves to be hypocritical imperialists, and showed they had absolutely no intention of granting liberty, equality, or justice to the Muslim world. The failure and hypocrisy of these Western political models in the region created a massive ideological vacuum and a furious, deeply bitter backlash. And from the ashes of this trauma, the counter-Enlightenment was born.
The counter-Enlightenment. This is where we see the organic rise of political Islam, or Islamism. And the author introduces us to the man who essentially formalized this new reactionary ideology, Hassan al-Banna. In 1928, amidst the chaos and British occupation of Egypt, al-Banna founds the Muslim Brotherhood.
Hassan al-Banna is a crucial figure to understand because he's often misunderstood. He wasn't a reactionary in the simplistic sense of wanting to go back to living in tents and rejecting all modern conveniences.
Right, he wasn't anti-technology.
No, he was an educated urbanite, a school teacher. He deeply appreciated and utilized the practical gains of the Enlightenment. He highly valued literacy, modern medical science, and particularly modern organizational and propaganda techniques. But philosophically, he believed that the grand project of the reformers, the attempt to synthesize Islam with Western liberal values, was a catastrophic failure that had only led to subjugation and moral decay.
He essentially banked the technological and organizational gains of the Enlightenment, but he completely weaponized them.
Exactly. He used modern tools, printing presses, youth organizations, social welfare programs to push for a return to fundamentalist traditional Islamic values. He argued that Islam wasn't just a private spiritual religion to be practiced in a mosque. He argued it was a comprehensive, all-encompassing system of government, economics, and law. He wanted a modern state, but one strictly governed by traditional Sharia.
He used modern tools for an anti-modern ideology. But Banna was still relatively pragmatic. The figure who takes Banna's movement, strips away any compromise, and hyper-radicalizes it into the violent, uncompromising ideology we recognize today is Sayyid Qutb.
Yes, Sayyid Qutb's life trajectory perfectly mirrors the darkening, radicalizing of the region's intellectual climate. Unlike earlier reformers like Tatawi or Mirza Saleh, who went to Paris or London in the 19th century, saw the Enlightenment in action, and came back inspired to modernize their homelands, Qutb goes to the West in the mid-20th century.
A very different time.
He goes to the United States in 1948, studying administration at a teacher's college in Greeley, Colorado, and his reaction to the West is the polar opposite of his predecessors.
He is absolutely viscerally disgusted by what he sees. It's fascinating because he is looking at post-war 1948 America, the booming economy, the pristine manicured lawns, the church socials. But Qutb looks at this idealized Americana and sees nothing but grotesque materialism, virulent racial segregation, and what he views as rampant, animalistic sexual liberalism.
He was repulsed.
He attends a church dance in Greeley, a completely innocuous event by American standards, and writes furiously about the lustful music, the integrated dancing, the bare arms of the women. He looks at their obsession with sports and lawn care, and he decides the West, despite its wealth, is completely morally bankrupt and suffering from a terminal spiritual emptiness.
So what does this all mean for the trajectory of the Middle East? Qutb returns to Egypt absolutely convinced that the Islamic world must not just reject Western political control, it must completely and violently reject Western values, Western culture, and Western models of society.
It's a total break.
But when he returns, the political situation in Egypt had drastically changed. The monarchy had been overthrown, and Gamal Abdel Nasser had taken power in a military coup. Nasser was establishing a secular, socialist, fiercely authoritarian state. Nasser saw the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat to his power and cracked down brutally. Qutb, who had become a leading intellectual in the Brotherhood, is arrested, tortured, and thrown into the notorious, filth-ridden Tura prison.
And it is in the darkness, the isolation, and the horrific torture of Nasser's prisons that Qutb's ideology crystallizes into something truly terrifying. Strip a man of his dignity, torture him for years, and he will not produce a philosophy of compromise. In prison, Quadvad writes a book called Milestones, which effectively becomes the foundational manifesto for modern, violent Sunni jihadism.
A dangerous book.
In it, he argues that the entire world, explicitly including the secular Muslim leaders like Nasser who govern without Sharia, has reverted to a state of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is a powerful Islamic concept. It refers to the state of pagan, barbaric ignorance that existed in Arabia before the Prophet Muhammad received the Quran. Qutbi is saying the society isn't just flawed, it is entirely illegitimate and un-Islamic.
And crucially, for our specific discussion of the Enlightenment and the history of ideas, Qutbi explicitly targets and attacks the rationalism of earlier reformers like Muhammad Abduh. He argues that Abduh was fatally wrong to elevate frail human reason to the same level as divine revelation.
He goes right after the Grand Mufti.
Qutbi demands a total, uncompromising rejection of philosophical speculation. He demands a violent return to Bailakafit, the doctrine of accepting God's law exactly as written, literally, without asking how or why, and without attempting to adapt it to modern sensibilities. Furthermore, he calls for a dedicated vanguard of pure believers to rise up, forcibly overthrow these apostate secular governments, and establish strict, unyielding Sharia law through armed struggle.
He is basically trying to undo 150 years of intellectual progress with a single book. He's trying to slam the gates of Ijtihad shut again, lock them, and demand absolute, unquestioning submission, backed by revolutionary violence. Qutb is eventually executed by the Egyptian state in 1966, hanged for treason, but his martyrdom only makes his ideas more powerful. His writings spread like wildfire across the frustrated, disenfranchised youth of the Middle East.
And this massive ideological shift, this fierce fundamentalist rejection of the West and secular modernity, was happening across the entire region, crossing sectarian lines. In Shia Iran, you have a highly influential secular intellectual named Jalal Ali Ahmad. He writes a book in 1962 called Gurb Zadegi, which translates roughly to Westoxification or Occidentosis, treating Western influence like a biological disease or a plague.
Westoxification.
He argues forcefully that Iran has been poisoned by an infatuation with Western machines, Western consumerism, and Western culture, and that this disease is actively destroying their authentic, pure Islamic identity.
He's basically providing the secular anti-colonial argument that perfectly complements the religious arguments of the Islamists. He's saying the Enlightenment wasn't a universal human triumph, it was a toxic imperial import designed to enslave them.
Yeah.
And this intense intellectual and theological backlash ultimately climaxes in spectacular real-world violence.
It erupts.
In Iran, the concept of Westoxification fuels the massive 1979 Islamic Revolution, which successfully overthrows the secular Western-backed Shah and installs a hardline anti-Western theocracy under Ayatollah Khomeini. And in Egypt in 1981, Sayyid Qutb's militant ideology reaches its grim, logical conclusion. A radicalized military officer named Khalid al-Islambouli, deeply influenced by Qutb's writings, assassinates the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, during a live military parade. As Islambouli pulls the trigger, he shouts, "I have killed the pharaoh."
It is a profoundly deep, symbolic moment. By calling Sadat the pharaoh, he is casting the secular, Western-backed, autocratic modern state as the ultimate ancient enemy of God. The assassination is the counter-enlightenment violently striking a fatal blow against the heirs of the modernizers. It symbolically ushers in the modern era of transnational jihadism, state-sponsored extremism, and the sectarian violence that so heavily dominates the geopolitical headlines today.
Wow. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. Let's summarize the incredible, turbulent journey we've taken you on. We started by looking at an Islamic world that, after the breathtaking brilliance of its medieval golden age, had fallen into centuries of defensive, fearful stagnation.
Stuck and tackled.
This stagnation was defined by Taklid and Bila Kaif, the blind emulation of past authorities, and a refusal to question the natural world. We saw how this stagnant world was violently, shockingly awakened by Napoleon's invasion in 1798. Through the 19th century, we followed incredible, visionary figures who tried to bridge the gap. Tatawi, who ingeniously translated the threat of Western liberty into the familiar comfort of Islamic justice. Mirza Saleh, who fought conservative suspicion to bring the printing press to Iran. Afghani, who mobilized the masses against imperialism with pan-Islamism. And Muhammad Abduh, who boldly smashed, tackled, and embraced evolutionary science and reason. They definitively proved that a true, organic Islamic Enlightenment was underway.
But we also saw how the immense trauma of World War I, the betrayal of the Treaty of Versailles, and the brutal, hypocritical realities of Western imperialism fractured that fragile progress. That political humiliation and lack of sovereignty created the fertile, bitter ground for the counter-Enlightenment. In this dark soil, figures like Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb emerged, weaponizing modern political organization and anti-colonial rage to launch a fundamentalist backlash against Enlightenment rationalism, ultimately birthing modern Islamism and the violence we see today.
And this brings us to the author's ultimate, most vital takeaway for us today. It is highly inaccurate, completely unhistorical, and frankly ignorant for Western commentators to sit back and casually claim that Islam somehow missed the Enlightenment, or that the religion is inherently incompatible with modernity. The truth is far more complex, traumatic, and tragic. The Islamic world has been actively wrestling with these massive tectonic societal forces, Reformation, Enlightenment, and industrialization, all at the exact same time under extreme imperial pressure for 2 solid centuries.
Exactly. The geopolitical headlines and the evening news might focus exclusively on the bombs, the autocrats, and the violent counter-Enlightenment. But the author stresses a crucial reality. The millions upon millions of modern, secular, or moderately observant Muslims living their lives today, whether they are doctors in Cairo, engineers in Tehran, or citizens in London and New York, are the living, breathing proof of the Islamic Enlightenment's enduring success. The deep-seated desire for these Enlightenment values for justice, political representation, scientific truth, and individual sovereignty is still incredibly alive in the region. We saw brilliant flashes of it in the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, where millions marched for democracy, and during the sweeping demands for dignity during the Arab Spring in 2011. The monumental struggle between faith and reason, between the heirs of Abdu and the heirs of Qutb, is not over. It is fiercely ongoing.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder as we close. When a civilization is forced to evolve not organically over 400 years at its own comfortable pace like Europe did, but rather at gunpoint over just a few decades, constantly under the shadow of foreign empires dictating their borders, exploiting their economies, and overthrowing their leaders, is a violent, fundamentalist backlash like the Counter-Enlightenment really an anomaly of a specific religion? Or is it just the tragic, almost inevitable psychological cost of hyper-compressed, humiliated modernization? It makes you wonder how the West would have reacted, what kind of fundamentalisms we would have birthed if the roles of history were reversed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It is a dense, complex history, but truly understanding it completely changes how you see the world today. Keep questioning the simplistic, easy narratives of history. Keep digging deeper into the sources, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.